All right, Suzanne, thanks so much for doing this next episode on individualistic and collectivistic cultures. Now, my first question is, tell me a little bit about those and kind of what those are.
hmm Yeah, so collectivistic, so I guess going through the main difference between collectivistic versus individualistic cultures. Collectivistic cultures tend to be very group-centered, whether it's, tending to prioritize more the needs of, let's say, the family or the dominant culture, or maybe a particular society. Um, it's really mostly tied to like relationships. Um, and it's very much about like loyalty, family honor, kind of sacrificing for the greater good, very we oriented. Versus in contrast, individualistic cultures are mostly all about the individual, I over we, um, more values centered around personal freedom, expressing your truth, kind of doing what's right for you as an individual, putting that more as a priority, and having kind of your identity be more separate. And it's really just success tends to be defined more by personal achievement as opposed to, just doing what's right for the family, putting the family's needs or the culture's needs first.
Mm-hmm. So, but then, because I rem often, because you would see those two dynamics, one example would be travel. 'Cause I'm not sure if you've traveled to other countries that highlight individualistic versus collectivistic
Yeah.
cultures, but could you share that?
Sure, a little bit. Yeah. So, you know, collectivistic cultures, if you travel to certain countries that tend to be more collectivistic, and a lot of that tends to be, Latin America, Asia, Middle East, maybe certain African cultures, um, you kind of have to think about what is the norm of that culture, right? And kind of adapting and molding to that, just out of respect and out of just, again, it's like being in line with those values versus individualistic. There is a little bit more freedom in maybe even in the basic things like maybe dress or just kind of how you express yourself or um yeah. So when you travel, it's always good to obviously, do some research, right? And just be cognizant around if it is more of a collectivistic versus individualistic, and if there are certain things to be mindful of. I know in particular when you go to Middle Eastern countries, you have to be cognizant, especially as women, as far as how you dress, right? Those countries tend to the women tend to dress very modestly. And of course, every country's different. Even in the Middle East, there are certain countries that tend to be more trying to lean more towards being more individualistic, even though it's mostly collectivistic, but there is more openness towards more personal choice and more personal freedom. And that can translate, in the example of, how you choose to dress. So even in the Middle East, there are countries or even areas within countries where there is more openness around, women not needing to stick to some of the previous traditional norms. And obviously other ones, you have to be mindful of that, where it does tend to be more traditional.
Hmm. It's kind of like this idea of like relationships in the first episode, when a person that is in a relation when a person from an individualistic culture, let's say an American, is in a relationship with an Arab Muslim woman, the guy the person has to decide, should I convert? Should I do this? Should I do that? Um, because because I know I have a friend who is married to someone of an Arab Muslim culture, and so she had to wear, the traditional dress and all that kind of stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, and also, nowadays it's about kind of finding how do we blend and merge the two, right? The collectivistic versus the traditional, right? So, for example, in an example like that, I know something that I tend to see is that it may be, let's say, in that example, maybe the friend, maybe she does just out of respect and out of respect of the collectivistic, more traditional, maybe dressing up a certain way around family, maybe around, let's say, the family, right? Maybe choosing to maybe cover a little bit more and respect that. But maybe when she's with her partner and maybe he's trying to steer a little, he tends to take on maybe more some of the more individualistic values. Um, there is room to there is room for maybe more personal freedom and maybe more personal self-expression where she doesn't maybe need to cover up as much or maybe not feel the need to wear some of those traditional clothing. So that's kind of an example of how you merge and you blend the two.
Mm-hmm. And because how do you sort of see that in your private practice, this idea of individualistic and collectivistic cultures?
Yeah, yeah. So I know, with my clients, that tends to be a challenge. That tends to be a big challenge of theirs, where it's like they live in a country, the US, which does tend to be individualistic, right? And that tends to be some of the values that get, pushed. And then their families collectivistic and really trying to reconcile the two and trying to kind of manage those feelings of guilt, um, feeling mixed feelings, not knowing kind of which direction to go in. Obviously they don't want to self-abandon, they don't want to have to abandon parts of their identity and who they are, but at the same time, they do want space to maybe explore and kind of form their own maybe value system or how they want to blend the two. So, something that I kind of work with my clients is how do we bridge the gap, right? How can we bridge the gap and what's that going to look like for you? Because that might look different for, every person. So it's really, I center it back to the client, like what feels aligned? What are maybe aspects of the collectivistic that you feel resonate or aligned with you and that you can retain, and what are maybe aspects of maybe being more individualistic that you feel you want to explore. And a way that we blend that, I can just give an example, is like, let's say a client, you know wants to go to university and maybe wants to go to a university that's out of state, right? So individualistic would be like, oh, go for it. Go for it, right? If that's what you want to do, go for it. Whereas the collectivistic, when you think about the family, that might be a challenge, right? Because maybe the family wants to keep you close, right? They
Mm-hmm.
want you to stay close. And also in a lot of traditional Arab households, adult kids don't tend to move out until they're married, right? So a way to maybe bridge that, maybe in that example, could be having the family on board, right? Trying to help include the family in that process, right? So like, having them be involved in some way, whether it's helping them choose taking their input as far as choosing the university, or maybe make it a thing to maybe visit more, or I don't know, just finding a way to include the family in that process would be one way to honor the collectivistic while also being like, okay, but yeah, I do want to go out of state or maybe go to this university. And that would be the individualistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've I've had that example about, going to college and then where to go. I can relate to that because, you know, I remember I wanted to go to one university, they had a radio program and then my my parents were just like, "No, why don't you stay here?" And stay more in tune with your family. So I can relate to that. My next question is, how do you sort of help people, navigate the individualistic versus the collectivistic cultures?
Yeah, so obviously, it's very case by case, with my clients, obviously I give them space to kind of share with me kind of what are the norms or what are, especially within their family, right? And also another thing is that not all families are the same, right? Some families are already maybe adopting more individualistic values. So they may not be strictly so traditional and so collectivistic. So really trying to kind of understand what is maybe the norm, what are some things that tend to be like a no. Um, and really, I do a lot of somatic work. Again, I come from a trauma training perspective, and a lot of that includes leaning into the body, right? And noticing how decisions and how certain things feel in the body. So, for example, if they're trying to make a decision about something, I'll have them explore all these different options, and I'll invite the client to really, just close their eyes and just notice how the decision lands in their body, right? I like invite them to really think about, okay, what does that feel like? Does that feel aligned? Does that feel familiar in the sense of maybe in the past making a decision that did feel aligned for you, you know? And as a way to kind of re explore that and reconcile some of that. And again, it's like it's the case by case where really helping them kind of navigate what is it going to look like for them to blend the two. What would that look like? And what are maybe aspects that they want more personal freedom in, right? What are the aspects that they do want that individualistic framework to work for them versus maybe other ways that they maybe value more of the collectivistic? So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be different. So, for example, maybe one client, when it comes to the marriage process, let's say, maybe they tend to grab maybe the collectivistic way of having the family help them choose a partner and maybe find them a partner and be involve the families and having them be part of that. Maybe that aligns for them. That makes sense for them. That's something that they found to be successful, maybe in their family or something that they want to try. So in that case, I encourage that, right? If that feels aligned. Maybe for someone else, that is where the individualistic aspect comes into play, where they're like, that doesn't really, that I really want that to be more of a personal process, right? I want that to be something that I want to navigate for myself. And that is where that would show up. So again, it could be different for each person. And I
Mm-hmm.
try, and I also another thing that I do is I really try to normalize it. I really try to normalize the challenge behind it and the feelings that come with that, that could come with that, whether it's, feelings of guilt, feeling like, oh my God, am I going to be disrespecting certain people? Am I not staying true to myself or parts of my identity? So I really normalize that those feelings may come up and and give space for that while this is happening.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of this idea, like the collectivistic culture, in this idea of control versus the individualistic culture, the idea of freedom, personal choice, and how those two kind of conflict.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And I guess my last question is, what can people take away from this? How can people sort of, what can people do if they were confronted, with that situation? How can they sort of um do to be like more I wouldn't like kind of figure out how to like n navigate those two dynamics, I guess.
Dynamics. Yeah, I think one way that I sometimes will reflect to clients or I think would be helpful is maybe try to think about a personal situation. Maybe try to reflect on a personal situation where those two pieces came into play, where it seemed like it was like a battle or a conflict between, let's say, the individualistic versus a collectivistic, and reflect on maybe how you handled that and if the outcome felt aligned with you. So think about maybe a past example of when you were in that situation, how you handled it, and if it felt aligned and if it felt like you were honoring both or it felt like balanced, then maybe look into that experience as information, right? Use that kind of as a guide. So, for example, if someone comes in with a particular situation where they're having to navigate both, I'll ask them like, hey, is this something that you've encountered before? A situation very similar to this. How did you navigate it? and what was kind of the end result? And did you feel like that worked out in a way that felt aligned? And if it did, we explore that. We explore kind of what that looked like, right? Did that involve more family involvement? Did that involve more, using the family to some degree? Did that involve using peers? That involve, alone time in making that? We try to work with the things that maybe have worked. And hey, if it didn't, if it felt like I don't know if that really stayed true to me and I kind of want to try something different, we go from there. So really just kind of leaning into just kind of your process and your history with that, I think, I like to always bring it back to the client because ultimately that's going to look different for everyone.
Mm-hmm. All righty.